Well, good morning. My name is Mike Bryan. I'm a volunteer with the Southern Arizona VA in Tucson, Arizona. Today's date is Tuesday, August the 9th, 2016. In Tucson, Arizona, we're at the home of veteran Russ Violett, Air Force pilot. And Russ, why don't you give me your full name and your birth date?
My full name is Russell Leroy Violett. I was born on the 7th of June, 1935.
35.
In northern Montana.
Well, now that you've kind of started in that direction, tell me about life before you went into the military.
Well, I lived on a cattle ranch and a wheat farm in northern Montana. At the time that I was born, in the 35 time period, it was right after the Depression. We didn't have very much. The folks didn't have very much. They moved a couple of shacks together, and that became home. A lot of mice were the nightly experience. We learned how to put up with mice. Of note, we had a outdoor toilet that was about 100 feet from the door. You used that day and night, winter and summer. And when it was 30 below zero, you used the porcelain potty that was available, and if you used it, you cleaned it up yourself. Was the rule of the family. We had a majestic cooking stove with a water reservoir on it to heat water that we then moved to a little tin tub that we took baths in on Saturday afternoon. That was like that until I was in about the 7th or 8th grade. The farm started to make some money. They bought some more things. It was 17 miles to the schoolhouse. And then when I was 9 years old, my dad got me a permit to drive myself and my brother to that school. And the rule was that you couldn't drive on the county or federal highways, so we drove in the ditches. And we got to school. When the snow got too deep, then Dad hauled us to school. Then he moved us all to town later on. We had no electricity, and so we didn't have things to play with, if you will, and we had to make up what we did on a daily basis to enjoy ourselves. Dad did that by giving us each a horse, and so my brothers and I would get on the horses and we'd hunt coyote and rabbit and whatever else we could get our hands on during the day, and most of the time we'd come home with nothing. But sometimes we did have some successes. Those were fun times. I still like to ride horses.
Well, you said your grandfather homesteaded?
Grandfather homesteaded. The Violett family first arrived in this country, before it was a country, in the 1660 time period. And a branch of that family moved to Kentucky in the 1700s. And then in the 1800s, another branch moved from Kentucky to Missouri. And then in the 1900 time period, my grandfather moved from Missouri through North Dakota to a homestead here in Montana. That was a half section at that time for the Montana homesteads. So he started that particular structure, and that's where my dad and his younger sister were both born, on that farm in the 1913, 1915 time period. That farm then grew into a ranch, then it grew into a larger exercise, and if you advance it all the way to today, my brothers both have farms there and family that run, so they raise a lot of wheat, no cattle.
And no horses.
And no horses.
What was there in the midst of all of that drew your attention to flying?
Well, World War II was on when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. In 1945, when it ended, I was 10. when my uncles came back from the war, some of them had been, one was a pilot in a B-17, another had been a gunner on a B-17, and I had an uncle that enjoyed private flying, and he had a Super Piper Cub, and he used to come by the house and steal me from Dad when he had me working, and he'd say, "Russ, we got to go out and kill some coyotes." So he'd throw me in the back seat of this Piper, open the doors up, and say, "Now, when you shoot, don't hit the wings." So,
Always good
so
advice.
he'd take me out, we'd fly up and down the canyons and looking around for coyotes. And in those days, there were also some wolves involved, but they disappeared later on. Anyway, that gave me a taste of flying. After I graduated from high school, I'll come back to that later, but and going into the Air Force, how did I get into it? The draft was on for Korea, and in 1954, you had to have a college deferment to avoid the draft, and one way to do that was to be in a junior ROTC program, or a ROTC program at the university. So at the University of Denver, I signed up for Air Force ROTC, and 4 years later graduated with a commission. And I had a pilot slot. I went to pilot training out of college, and the rest is history, as they say.
Well, why the Air Force?
Why the Air Force? Well, there's primarily when I was young again, and we were taking care of cattle, and Dad would take the horses and hit a sleigh. We'd go out to a haystack, we'd fill a sleigh up with hay, and then we'd take it to the cattle. It was 30 below zero in the wintertime, there was a 40-knot wind blowing, and way up there in the blue sky, there was contrails, and those happened to be SAC fighters, F-84s, that were flying out of a base that was at Great Falls, Montana. And I'd see those time and time again, and I'd say, that's got to be a great way of life. I think I want to do that. And of course, that's what I did.
The seed was planted. And so as you were dealing with the draft, then you got into ROTC then at University of...
Yep, University of Denver.
Denver.
And, got my commission in June of 1958. And the pilot slot was for December of that year. So I stuck around home and helped with the farm that summer. And,
So when you actually went into the Air Force, then talk a little bit about like the training and where you went. And...
Okay, before I do that, my wife and I grew up together there in this little town. She lived about 12 miles from where I grew up, and we went through grade school and high school together. And in our freshman year of college, we didn't like being apart, so I gave her a ring and we got married in 11th of September 1955. So I went through the last 3 years of college married, and then about 2 years after we got married, our first daughter arrived. And then the first year we were in the Air Force, our second daughter arrived. And I'll jump ahead a little bit. Then we had 2 more daughters in the 62-63 time period. So I ended up with 4 wonderful kids. Now, what was the question again?
Well, we were just jumping around
Yeah.
here. It'd be fine.
Yeah.
So with the training and so when you went into the Air Force, what...
Yeah, I went when I got in the Air Force. Went through pilot training, got the wings. I was lucky enough to have finished high enough in my class to get an F-100, which was a prized assignment out of pilot training. I got one. I was assigned to Luke Air Force Base in the summer of '60. And
They don't...
I went through F-100 training there, then went to advanced training at Nellis Air Force Base in the fall of 1960. While I was in training at Nellis, learning, nuclear delivery and some other issues associated with the mission, I had the pleasure of ejecting from an airplane on takeoff.
Tell us about that.
That was exciting. There was the principal thing that made it interesting was that I had flown in the morning with this instructor pilot in a flight of 4 and went out to an aerial target, a DART it was called. Then we came down and landed. I had duty officer that afternoon in the squadron, and as I'm sitting at the desk, this same instructor pilot, who was an exchange pilot from Canada, Carruthers was his name, call sign Maple, since he was from
Still
Canada.
remember that, huh?
Came out of a briefing room with the 3 students that he had, but one of those students was still drunk from the night before and was having trouble walking, let alone talking, and not able to really fly. So he said, Russ, Dutch is going to take your place. You're going to go fly this afternoon. And same thing we did this morning. Any questions, you'll be in my wing. I said, no questions. So went out to the airplane. Everything was normal. It was a C model, which meant that the F-100C had no flaps, so it meant that you had a higher takeoff speeds and higher landing speeds than the aircraft with flaps. Anyway, we got in the aircraft, taxied out to the runway. Everything was go. He nodded his head to release brakes and go afterburner, and we did that. A couple thousand feet of roll later, the Nellis control tower called Maple Lead and said, Maple Lead, Nellis Tower, and he said, stand by tower. And so he gave the gear up sign, and sort of gear up, burner sign, auto burner, and he said, Nellis Tower, this is Maple Lead, go ahead. And he said, Roger, Maple, be advised your number 2 man has orange flame coming out of the left side of his fuselage. And
That's you.
I'm flying on the left wing, tight formation, and I said, my God, that's me. I kicked it out a little bit, glanced into the cockpit, and I had 2 red lights on, a fire warning light and a fire light. And I said, oh my God. And as I moved out, I can still see him out there just a little bit to my right and a little bit below me. I could see him turn his head around, so he looked back, and his words were not repeatable here, except the meaning was, get the heck out of that airplane now.
Well, you're not very high up either, are you?
Well, we were about 200 feet in the air at the time. And we're still over the end of over the runway type thing, just departing the departure end. And so I kicked it out, pulled back on the nose a little bit, and it started to roll into him. And I couldn't control it with the aileron, so I stepped on the left rudder, and that picked the right wing up. And we climbed maybe another couple hundred feet and got up to about 500 feet. And the airplane started to roll away from it. I couldn't control it, so I ejected at that point.
How high were you then?
I was about 500 to 600 feet in the air, probably. I was very fortunate, very lucky. There was about a 25 knot wind blowing on the ground. So when I landed, I went for a ride before I could get my head put together and get the disconnects on the parachute, which was a single cover, a release, and then the canopy would dump itself. Did that. So it was a little bit, I wasn't really shook up, but I was, oh my God. I'm standing there in my G-suit, and I'm shaking a little bit. And so I said, I think I better sit down before I pass out. So I sat down, laid back, hit the back of my head on a shale rock, cut it. It's bleeding all over my shoulder when the chopper gets there. He says, oh my God, you're hurt. I said, no, I'm not hurt. Take me to the squadron. No, you're going to the hospital. So I went to the hospital.
Had to have some stitches or whatever.
Right.
Did you ever figure out what caused the fire?
Yes, there's a thing in the F-100, when you remove the engine from the airplane, you remove the aft fuselage. And the aft fuselage covers the afterburner area and that sort of thing. And there was what they called some Wiggins quick disconnects, and some of those pigtails and disconnects had not been secured properly, and so they came apart, and so they were feeding high pressure fuel into an afterburner area on the outside of the burner, right in the vicinity of the hydraulic actuators for the horizontal slab, and so it burned through that, and that's about the time I got out of the airplane.
But there was a fix for whatever it was.
Well, it just, yeah, it's called improved maintenance procedures.
Well, what made the F-100 such a choice?
Well, it was a prize fighter. You know, it was a Century Series fighter. Remember, this is 1960, and so the F-100 had come out as a result of the Korean War. It was around since the 54-5 time period, but it was still a very prized aircraft by all the single-engine fighter pilot types that like that airplane. It was a tactical aircraft, so you delivered ordnance, and it also had a nuclear capability, so you were sitting on nuclear targets later on, strip maps and all the things that go with it in Europe as well as in the Far East. And that's another story unto itself.
Well, tell me a little bit about the mood of the country at that time, because it's after the Korean War. It was getting into the time when there was tension was tension with Russia and Cuba, and all of that was going on.
Well, the Cuban crisis, the missile crisis in Cuba, I was sitting on alert in an F-100 at Kunsan Air Base in Korea. And the Quemoy Matsu issues came up at that time, and the North Koreans were intruding into airspace, and the missile crisis in Cuba brought one thing or another up, and so some of the 86s that the U.S. was flying, that the Koreans were flying, had gotten shot up by some North Korean MiGs, and they were recovering at Gimpo and Osan and Kunsan. And there was a precautionary taxi of the nuclear forces at Kunsan and Osan, and we taxied off the line with live ordnance, or nuclear ordnance, and we're behind the control vehicle waiting to take the runway if we got a launch order. And so that was kind of the tension of the times in that period. And to reemphasize that, the country was scared to death of nuclear holocausts, that sort of thing. And so everybody had shelters, and I went home, I remember in the 63 time period from Japan, and visited home, and Dad had built a underground shelter out on the farm and put railroad ties over it, so they had survival food and survival equipment and a shelter to get away from the radiation. And so the country was scared.
You were pretty close to some of the nuclear missile silos too out there, weren't you? Or no?
Well, they were all around us.
Yeah.
Yeah. They went in when I was, in the grade school, high school time period. Those were all constructed all around Montana.
Yeah.
So they had 3 squadrons at Malmstrom that operated the missile systems, and those guys, I'm not sure how many missiles each squadron had, but I think it was 12. And so there's a lot of holes around, 36 holes spread around there.
Right.
None of them very close to each other.
So you all would have been right in the middle of
right
target.
in the middle of it, right.
Yeah.
And when they built the anti-missile shield, if you will, for the nuclear ballistic missiles from Russia, the first center they built was about 10 miles from our home up there. And they abandoned it before it was ever operational. But the structure is still there.
Well, I think sometimes we go from World War II to Korea, and then some leap ahead to Vietnam. But it's there was a terribly tense time there for a long time.
Right.
It seems like.
Right.
And so were you all having periodic drills and whatever to stay alert?
Well, on the nuke pads, if you didn't have a nuke elephant walk on a daily basis.
What's an elephant walk?
An elephant walk is where you get up, start the aircraft, check in, and if you're nuclear armed, you weren't taxiing, but an elephant walk would be to taxi the aircraft down, get to the number one position, simulate that you were taking off, and taxi back into your parking spot. So that when on an IG team later on in my life, you check the maintenance capability and readiness of a unit, wing level units, with up to 72 or 96 aircraft, and you'd have an elephant walk where every one of those aircraft that was operationally ready and assigned to a target had to get out in a certain amount of time and taxi down the runway. And not with nuke weapons on, but simulated weapons on, but it was the aircraft thing. So that was frequent. They were called fast boys in Korea. And so if the siren came on and was steady, that was a practice. If the siren came on and wailed up and down, that was the real thing. And so we had about 30 lines between the F-100s and the B-57s from Johnson that were sitting on alert with us at Kunsan. So we had quite a few folks that were sitting on the alert pads and working that structure. So lots of funny stories about the alert pads. People were always playing games with each other, that sort of thing. And so one of the things that we did was it was 800 miles from Misawa Air Base, Japan to Kunsan, and we couldn't sit nuclear alert in Japan because it was against the rules. So you had to go to Korea to sit nuclear alert. So once a week, an old C-124 would pick up the pilots from Misawa and take them to Kunsan. Later on, that became a C-130. It got noisy, so as you climbed in the C-130, the crew chiefs, loadmasters always handed you a wax plug so you can plug up your ears and cool it off. But we didn't tell some of the new guys that was what it was for. And he was passing these things out, and this one guy said, "God, I love this bubble gum." And he took it and stuck it in his mouth. He thought. And so the next guy that's never been there before stuck it in his mouth. Did not enjoy that at all. And then he realized he'd been hid. There's lots of stories like that.
It gets chewier after you've had it in your ears for a while.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like young guys out, always having some fun.
Yeah.
Always having some fun.
Let me go back to, if I can, for a second. I said I got married in the sophomore year of college. We had those 4 girls. That became the central part of my life. The Air Force was important, family was important, but we were quite religious at the time. Still are a little as far as that goes. But we saw to it that the girls all had the right things happen to them when they were in all these different places they went. So as we moved around the world, we made 26 moves in our Air Force career. The girls rarely got to go to the same school 2 years in a row in the latter part of their grade school and high school experience, except one did go to the same high school all 4 years, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Of interest to me was that those experiences gave them a very broad understanding of the cultures in several places. We lived in Japan for 3 years, we lived in Spain for a couple of years, we lived in Germany for a couple of years, and we lived in Saudi Arabia for a couple of years. By the time I got to Saudi, the youngest one was in college, and so the kids didn't go with us to that site. But in the process, they learned to speak the language of the country we're in. Most of them have at least 2 languages in their vocabulary, and so they can communicate well. Without patting myself on the back too much, they all are very successful. I'll just leave it at that.
You're allowed to pat yourself on the back.
They gave me 14 grandkids, and the 14 grandkids have now, we're up to 5 great-grandkids, and we have 4 more that are due before the end of the year. And one of my grandkids married a gal that had a 9-year-old daughter, so we're up to 10 great-grandkids.
That's awesome. I saw a picture that you had of the family too.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful family. Well, since you ejected like within a couple years or whatever after you early in your career.
November 18th, 1960, 1:43 in the afternoon.
But the fact that that happened so early in your career, did that kind of not frighten you, but I mean, did that concern you?
There was a concern per se, but like getting bucked off a horse, the way you get back on the horse is the next time you're in the corral, you get back on the horse. So the air crews, the commander, the squadron commander, the ops officer at that time said, "I've got you scheduled for a sortie tomorrow morning, be on it." When I got off that one, he said, "Take a week's leave." So he got me back in the airplane, then sent me away to think about it for a week. And then when I came back, it never crossed my mind again to worry about it.
But it was something that you wanted to address, or
Right,
yeah.
right. That's it.
Okay. The you were stateside, if I remember right. You were stateside and Vietnam was kind of starting up, and
I'd left Massawa in 1963 after spending 3 years there flying the F-100, and I had about 800 hours of flying time. Was selected to go to F-105s at McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas, and so when I left Massawa, I landed at Wichita, Kansas, and in the spring of 1964, a couple of us were sent out to Nellis Air Force Base to check out in the F-105. We did that then, and we got back to McConnell. The mixture of air crews there, we had 2 wings at McConnell, and so we had a lot of pilots and a lot of aircraft, and the mixtures were experienced fighter types, experienced 105 types, and then we had quite a few folks that had come to us from Air Defense Command and some other commands that did not have a lot of technical experience. So the old heads took the young heads, and they kind of led them through the pastures so that we didn't step on things you shouldn't step on.
Well, what's the difference between a fighter pilot type and a 105 type?
Well, a fighter pilot, a fighter pilot is a mindset. Essentially, you refer to a fighter pilot, I refer to a fighter pilot if he's got, he flies single seat fighters and he's got one engine. And so that's a fighter pilot. Does that. A 105 fighter pilot, same thing, because that's a single engine. It's one cockpit. You have some aircraft had 2 cockpits, but those were for special missions. I didn't fly that. So I checked out in the 105, got back to McConnell, flew for a year, a little better than a year, going to exercises, working those issues, and got about 250 hours in the airplane in that year. And in the spring of 1965, the Tonkin Gulf incident occurred, and they started to deploy aircraft from the States and Japan to Thailand to start working against North Vietnam. And that would have been in April of 1965.
Well, that deployment came up kind of quick, didn't it?
Yeah. It came up very quick, and we'd of course been having exercises to get ready for ORIs and that sort of thing, and so the whistles were always blowing, and you got tired of packing suitcases to go through the mobility line, so everybody just stuffed pillows in their suitcases and went and checked through the mobility line, that sort of thing. But this time it was different, so we put real clothes in the suitcase this time, and 2 days later we took off. And we landed at Hickam. It's 4,000 miles away. It was a 9.5-hour flight, a single-seat airplane,
In
one
Hawaii,
engine
Hawaii.
with all the water in the world all the way around you. So that got your attention. Then we did the next day. We went to Guam, and 2 days later, due to weather, we got to Tokli in Thailand,
yeah.
which is about 90 miles north of Bangkok. And then 2 days after that, we were bombing in North Vietnam. And so we had
Laos, you said.
those Laos was part of it. That's right. But this first sorties were North Vietnam almost exclusively for the first month or so, and then they opened up the Laos. It was still the secret war in that time period, and so they were announcing things in North Vietnam, but they were not announcing things in Laos until spring, late winter, early spring. Right after we got there, they started having Laos targets. Mostly in the southern part of it, south of Plaine de Jars and down to the DMZ area of South Vietnam.
So what were your targets?
Bridges, for the most part, railroads, trains, bomb dumps, cargo type stuff that was being moved by the North Vietnam to their units in the south, the Viet Cong. So the interdiction campaign was the biggest part of that, in that you cut roads and bombed targets, but they were very difficult to see. The canopies of the jungle were in the 300-foot category, and so they'd park underneath those canopies. And if you knew where they were, you might be able to do something about it. But rarely did we see trucks actually moving. Once in a while you'd catch a convoy out in the open. But something had happened to force them out there so that you could attack those without too much of a problem.
Well, during that time, isn't that when you started losing people?
Well, we started losing people from day one almost. For the second day of the war, one of our pilots, Sam Woodward, got target fixation, and he pressed in too close and had selected the wrong delivery approach angle to this target. In that behind the target was a mountain. And based on his proximity to the ground when he released his bombs, he had no room to pull out, and he ran into the mountain on his pullout. So that was the first casualty. Over the period of that 4-month TDY, we had several pilots lost in that effort.
That's a tough one.
Tough, yeah, it's tough. I'll get into the first missile raid if you'd like me to do that.
Sure.
On the 25th of July 1965, the North Vietnamese had fired some surface-to-air missiles from a couple of sites west of Hanoi and knocked down an RF-4, a reconnaissance airplane, and damaged another one. And 2 days later, we were targeted against those particular surface-to-air missile sites. They were 1.7 miles apart, about 10 miles west of Hanoi. Now, of interest, as we bombed targets in North Vietnam in the May and June time period, and first part of July, we watched surface-to-air missile sites being constructed, and they were off limits by the White House and the JCS. Couldn't attack them.
Why?
Even if they fired at us, it was illegal to be inside of a certain parameter around those sites. So they were concerned that the Russians that were on the ground building the sites would escalate the war if the U.S. went in and bombed those people who were building those sites. Anyway,
Do you have a feeling about that?
well, we were young. We were saluting the flagpoles. We were doing what we were told. We didn't really have too much of a thought, except that why in the hell can't we go in there and bomb those guys? So later on in life, learned some more things about it. But for now, let's just say that was a disappointment, would be an understatement, about our policies and our procedures that came out of the National Command Authorities, and the Pentagon, JCS, all of that sort of stuff. But anyway, we ended up being targeted against those particular sites. Of interest again was that Karat and Tok Lee both were programmed against those two missile sites. Karat was targeting one and Tok Lee the other. neither of us knew that the other was going to be there. We, from Talk-Lee, ingressed down the red from the northwest into the target area, and then we egressed after the target out the black to the southwest. Karat, on the other hand, ingressed on the black to their target, and then egressed on the Red River, which put both forces going through each other over the target because we were 1.7 miles apart and we had simultaneous TOTs. And whoever set it up, we all reacted rather violently to our bosses when we discovered what was going on.
When did you realize what was happening?
Well, not until they got on the ground. We knew something was going on because when we went out armed to take off, the number 3 man in the flight I was number 4, his ordnance all jettisoned on the ground when they armed the aircraft, so I was moved up to the number 3 position in the lead flight, and the spare was told to fill in. So as we got to the tanker, the spare joined up on the tanker. It turned out that he had never flown a combat mission before. He delivered an aircraft to the unit from Yokota, Japan, and wanted to fly a combat mission. And no, we'll put you in as a spare. You aren't going to go, probably, that sort of thing. Well, when this guy had the problem, he got into the flight. So I put him over on a special frequency and scored a comment, and I said, you have any questions about what we're doing? And he said, I don't have any idea. And I said, okay, keep this very simple. He said, I want you to do 3 things. First one is never, never, never fly below my altitude, because I knew I was going to be extremely low and very fast. The second thing is don't ever fly more than a plane's length behind me. So I want to see your pitot-static tube sitting out here on my left side of my aircraft, and I want you, that's the third thing, stay on the left side of my aircraft at all times. And so when we came down that IP, we were holding about 600 knots, 560 knots at 100 feet.
Pretty low.
Pretty low and pretty fast.
Yeah. Oh.
And we were getting calls. The flak started showing up about 30 miles out, and it got pretty heavy. And then the 57 millimeter and the 85s, as you're passing over their berms en route to the target, fireballs coming out of the guns were donut shaped and a lot of smoke. And if you were in the immediate proximity when it was fired, it was very explosive and noisy in the cockpit. And so it did get your attention. And in that process, the number 2 man in the flight I was in got shot down. And so the lead had come off and had circled back to see how he was doing in his parachute. And I was scared that surface-to-air missiles that were in the area, he was going to take out lead. So I yelled at lead to get his altitude back down. So he did. He lowered his altitude. And then between the two of us, we circled Costco on several occasions. And
that was the name of the pilot that was down.
Yeah. He was limp in the parachute, never waved, never changed positions, never did anything, and he went into the Black River. And then later, they helped try to get the rescue choppers in there to get him, but there was an attempt made, but they couldn't get him out of the water, and then you never heard from him again, never heard anything about him again, other than the fact that he was just lost. Killed in action.
Well, he was unresponsive on the way down, it sounds like.
Yeah. And that's where that was. And after the target, there was some other people who had been shot down, and they were working on rescuing a few other people, including from Talk-Lee/Karat. This particular instance, the guy was from Karat, and the command and control people. Cricket was the name of the C-130 group. And they asked me and my wingman to go get refueled and come back and be prepared to do whatever we had to do at the time. So we did that a couple of times. So we had taken off at about 11 o'clock in the morning. We'd gone through the mission area, flew a couple of sorties, refueled a couple of times, and then we were released and went back to Talkley to land, but there was a thunderstorms and stuff in the area, so we ended up landing at Karrat. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so it was about 6 hours of flying time on that combat sortie. We had a thermos bottle that everybody was part of the seat. Take a tube and drink water. Well, I'd gone through that water about 2 hours into the flight. There was no water left, and the flight suits were soaking wet because of the stress of the situation. Landed at Karrat, and I got out of my airplane and I went over to this wingman's position. He was a major. I was a young captain, and he couldn't get out of his seat. So I helped him get out of the seat and down the ladder. The thud cockpit sits about 13, 14 feet above the ground, so that's a pretty good ladder to get down to the stairs. And he got down to the bottom and he looked at me and he said, "My God, are they all like this?" And I said, "No, they aren't." But I said, "Thank God."
Why couldn't he get out of his cockpit?
He was just stressed out and tired, and had been so stressed out from the whole mission, with everything that was going on. He was just fatigued, just worn, absolutely worn.
Mentally, physically, and everything.
So we went over and we had a beer at the Karrat open mess there, and we ordered a hamburger. And about that time, we were into our second beer, and the ops officer walked in and says, "Hey, Talkley just called and wants you to bring those airplanes back now." And I said, "Oh my God, we just had some booze." And he said, "I never heard that. Get your ass in the airplane and go." So we did that.
Yes, sir. Well, tell me about the Thunder Chief. Which model is that?
That's the 105.
That's the one.
Thunder Chief, yeah. Republic built, the Thunderbolt was a P-47,
Okay.
and then the F-84 was a Republic aircraft, Thunder Streak, and then the Thunder Chief is the F-105, and the A-10 is Thunderbolt 2.
Oh my God! So Thunder's a big one.
Yeah.
What makes you go into some detail about the Thud, the Thunder Chief?
Well, the Thud was a very special airplane to me. The biggest issue there was that you just fit into it like a glove. Everything you wanted to do with either hand or what you wanted to look at, you could do it. Whereas I'm going to say the F4 wasn't pilot friendly as far as controlling the airplane. It flew very fast. It liked 400 knots. It liked 500 knots. Coming off the target, it was not unusual to see 750 knots or 800 knots on the deck going out to get joined up. So that gave you obviously some special advantages over aircraft that couldn't fly that fast.
Mm-hmm.
So the object was to use surprise, get over it, then get in your egress route at a very high rate of speed, and you should be okay. The Thud was used in that air-to-ground role a lot, and also for surface-to-air missile suppression. As a result of all of those missions, they lost about 50% of the F-105 fleet over North Vietnam during the course of the war from 65 to 72 time period. So 380 some aircraft, I think, were lost.
It's a lot of aircraft and a lot of pilots.
Yeah.
Were most of the pilots recovered or rescued? Or?
Of those that got shot down, I don't know the right statistics. It's in the category of about 40%, I believe, were not recovered, and then there was about 300 that were captured after being shot down. So
And of course,
those
that's
numbers may not be quite right.
Yeah, but it gives us some idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the 27th of July, and then after that, I mean, there was I mean, that was pretty much the event that really had an effect on you, or really impacted you.
That was, yeah, it's, to this day, it's like it was yesterday. And that 27 July 1965 raid, and all the people that were involved in that from both bases. We've had many reunions. We started a reunion complex for the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association, and we had practice reunions starting in the 67 time period. So after the war was over and the folks came home in the April of 1973, that fall we had our first real reunion for the River Red or Association at Las Vegas.
Well, 73 was the year that a lot of the POWs were released, and
All of them.
all of them.
Yeah, 373 of them.
Wow. You had friends in that group, no doubt.
Oh, lots of friends. Lots of friends. If I go back to the roles of the two wings we had at McConnell, we had 3 squadrons in each unit, 72 airplanes in each unit. And so we had 140 some odd planes plus air crews for those 140. So we're sitting around 200 air crews. And you go back and check off the air crews that were there in that time period, and those that died in Vietnam, 62% of those guys, that by my figures, never made it out of Vietnam. And so that's a pretty good number. That's very, very sad.
Those are pilots?
Those are pilots, and so the forget-me-not flag I just pointed at tries to remember those guys because they were part of what you were. You were part of what they were, and they gave it all.
Do their families attend the reunions?
Oh yeah, this is husband, wife, kids. Depends on where it's at as to how many show up. But we've had 2 reunions here in the Tucson area. I ran both of them as it turned out, but we had about 680 people at the second one that for a sit-down formal meal as part of that reunion, and the first one was right at 500. So everybody comes. The camaraderie associated with those that you flew combat with is a special tie. So you have some very common things that you don't forget.
Friends that you make and you keep under combat conditions. That's right. Yeah. Well, then that was the ejection. Then is there anything else in that Vietnam? People that you wanted to remember, or events?
No, it's just that there was a guy by the name of Herdlicka was shot down over Laos, and we never did really see him again. But the friendly types in northern Laos at this one particular spot versus the enemy were advancing up a hillside to where he had parachuted after he was shot down by some 37 millimeter gun systems. The wrong side got him and captured him, and he was moved around in the Laos area, primarily what we referred to then as the box, which was on the Plain de Georges. There was 9 huts in a box type arrangement, and we were told then that he was one of the pilots that was in that particular structure. So they put that unit off, that area off limits for any of us to bomb or strafe or anything else. So we knew what was going on there. Later on, his wife, as they were working the prisoner release, and before that happened, it was trying to get them to acknowledge that they had him, but they never did. The Laotians and the North Vietnamese never acknowledged that Herdlicka existed, and so he just never came home. And he was a very good friend.
Wow. sacrifices that are made
Yep.
on behalf
Absolutely.
of people here in this country. Are there other events or things that happen?
No, I know that there's lots of other little things, but being part of a fighter squadron and F-100, F-105, F-4, A-10, doesn't matter which one, there's a camaraderie that is developed between the air crew members in those things, and to include the ground crew. And so the tech sergeants and masters that were crewing your airplane became very close. And so to this day, some of those guys are showing up at some of our reunions, and I haven't seen them for 30 years or 40 years. But that's...
You were under their care.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep.
So after Vietnam, tell us a little bit about what after Vietnam.
Well,
what it looked
okay, came home from Vietnam, and I had a second tour in the 1969 time period in the F-105, and when I came back from that, I was assigned to F-4s at Torrejon Air Base in Spain. I went through the F-4 checkout in California, and then my wife and kids got on an airplane, and we landed at Torrejon, Spain, the 17th of March, 1970. How in the hell did I remember that? It was St. Patrick's
St.
Day.
Patty's Day. My mom was born in Ireland. What can I say?
So we did that. I was assigned to a fighter squadron there, and then about a year into that particular thing, there's a wing commander that asked me to go to the to the USAFE, United States Air Forces Europe IG team as a major and inspect operations on that team. So we spent about a year and a half at Torrejon, and then we went to Wiesbaden, Germany, where Lindsey Air Station was, and that's where the headquarters for that command was located. And so I worked on the IG team there for 2 years.
What were the responsibilities there?
Administratively, I designed and wrote the scenarios for the operational readiness inspections, which meant that you were working out of the top secret war plans and NATO plans as to what the requirements were for units to perform when you went to different posture levels, max posture, so the unit had to respond to that by doing loadouts, taxi outs, et cetera, et cetera. The other part of that was, what did you say? What was the responsibilities? Yeah. Essentially, just what I said.
Yeah. Well, you were again. It seems like on the front lines when you're in Germany. I mean, you're talking about the Eastern Bloc and the timing of all that.
That was, so you're looking at the capability of the NATO units, primarily in this case U.S. portions of NATO, to see how they would respond to airborne threats and ground threats. And so you wrote the scenarios so that you had this force moving towards you, and then you deploy forces against it. And so the scenario required aircraft to be generated and flown, and to go out to different practice areas, and simulate that there was meeting those folks. And we also had Red Dogs they're playing games as if they were the enemy, and so they had to close on those guys and put them in a defensive position and show they could kill it. Yeah. You had the responsibility to, since they were setting nuclear targets, to become a bomb commander, you had to learn, every segment of your strip map as to how you were going to move and how you're going to fly, what your IP points were, when you armed the weapon, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
What's the difference between like a regular bomb delivery versus a nuclear bomb delivery?
The weapon.
Well, yeah, but I mean, does it change how you fly in, or altitude, or speed?
Somewhat.
Or,
Conventional bombing is generally from a 30 to 45 degree dive angle, and unless you're using high drags, then you can come in level, low, or much more shallow, because it's dragging back behind you. So when they go off, you don't have an explosive array of ordnance that's coming back at the aircraft.
That would be like napalm or cluster bombs. And
Napalm, cluster bombs would be some of the retarded stuff. But the 750-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, 3,000-pound bombs, you deliver those from 45 degrees primarily, and or steeper. The 3,000-pound bomb, for instance, you had a requirement to have 6,000 feet separation on that bomb when it went off, because it would throw shrapnel back up to that altitude when it hit the ground. So it was significant. So if you pressed, you had timers, of course, your fuses were set, and most of the time safe separation on the fuse required about 8 seconds. And if you got below your release altitude, well, then you started screwing that timing up, and so the fuse wasn't armed when it hit the ground. So then we started taking shortcuts, and so we knew that we were dudding bombs by getting too low. So we changed the fuse to 6 seconds, which put ourselves at risk.
So, but the delivery of a nuclear bomb would be different from all that.
Well, you deliver. There's several techniques of delivering nuclear weapons. All of them require you to get to a position where you have the smallest silhouette available when the bomb itself goes off, because the overpressure of the system catches up to you, and if you get that overpressure of more than a couple of inches of pressure per square inch, then you've got a problem with your airplane, if you even have an airplane at that point.
Okay.
So you deliver nuclear ordnance primarily with the F-100. You did a labs maneuver, which meant you flew over the target and did a element turn, and on the way up you'd release the bomb. It would continue to go up, you'd come over, roll out, and drive yourself back to an escape altitude.
So you're actually flying up when you drop.
Right. So you're throwing the bomb up to somewhere around 20,000, 25,000 feet in the air, and it would turn over and come back down to the target. That was a free fall type weapon. And if you needed safe separation from that of X number of seconds. So that's what you were doing with that maneuver, is to get that safe separation. Then there's, as you advance the weapon systems, you went from the Mark 28 to a Mark 43, which could be which was a drogue retarded bomb, and it had a spike on the front of it. So you delivered that from about 100 feet, 200 feet at 500 knots, and so the drogue would come out, it would drive itself into a runway, and then it had a timer in it, which was like most timers that are set to go off later. It's based on acid eating through certain walls, and when that happened, well, then the trigger mechanism works.
You're probably watching with great personal interest all of the stuff that they're talking about, the European forces now, and whether America should be, helping if they don't pay their fair share, and all of this. Where do you come down on all of that?
Well, NATO is very important. The NATO structure is very important. That doesn't mean that shouldn't be reviewed. The NATO partnerships and share of the weight of making that force usable, by nature of the fact that the U.S. is a rich country and has put in more than 2% of their GDP towards that, or budget I should say, on an annual basis. Several countries have not contributed near the 2% category. So if, don't hold me to the numbers, but if you took the total budget that NATO has right now, the U.S. would be paying about 70% of the cost of that operation, with several countries, including a couple new ones, that have not contributed anything to that particular structure. So then you have to decide whether you want, how liable are you to go to their aid when and if they need aid, if they've contributed nothing. So I'm I don't think you can just keep adding people to NATO and not have everybody pay their fair share. And fair share is of course, political.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, then, so after you left Germany, then where did you go after that?
Germany, I went to the Armed Forces Staff College at Norfolk, Virginia, and 6 months later I was assigned to the Guard Bureau in the Pentagon. And I spent 2 years in programs in the National Guard Directorate. And then I went to the Tactical Directorate in the Air Force and working tactical programs at that level. Had several interesting assignments doing that. And my biggest one was I was in the Pentagon when we came out of Southeast Asia, and so we were doing a realignment of forces in Europe, the Pacific, and the United States. So I was carrying around this staff summary sheet that was about 400 pages long. And had everybody from ministers of defense and prime ministers and presidents sign off on different packages in that thing, and that all was executed in the 77 time period, 76, 77 time period. So that was a major things I was doing. I was working obviously for the DCS programs, a 3-star, but I was also working for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Jones at the time, briefing him on what was going on and how we were going to find these aircraft or that support element to make things work as we realigned forces worldwide. It was a very hard problem. Anyway, it was interesting.
Well, realigning is probably the watchword for today, I guess. It just seems like, trying to make do. I mean, as war battle changes.
Well, if you take that structure, I was working. There was 1,872 airplanes in that 18-wing or 26-wing complex, and as you move those assets around, in those days there was 150 some odd fighter squadrons. If you compare that to today's structure, you have 48 squadrons. And so 100 and some odd squadrons have been dissolved, retired, put in the boneyard. And so we don't have the capability that we had in the mid-'80s because the forces have just been reduced so much. At the same time, the weapons reserves, WRM, War Reserve Material stocks have been depleted. They're not gone, but they haven't been replaced at the rate that they're consuming them, so there's not very many sorties available there in the War Reserve component. So I'm very, very frustrated and upset that we've allowed ourselves to get in a position where we can be defeated because we just don't have the assets. You don't get people trained back up in a short period of time. You can take people out overnight, but if you don't do anything with them for 10 years and then you want to have a capability, you've got a pretty hard road ahead of you before you can get yourself operational again. So
it's easier to stay operational than it is to start up again. Yeah. Well, there was one story in here that you had talked about being in Saudi Arabia. I was interested in hearing your description of what life was like in that country.
Well, Saudi, when I was assigned to Saudi in the summer of 1985, I was at TAC headquarters, and I was a commander of the first TAC fighter wing, First Air Force, which had all the air defense forces in North America assigned to it. From that position, I was sent to Saudi, but there was no forewarning, no criteria. I didn't have anything that told me anything about the country. I didn't have anything that told me anything about where things were in the country. So for the next 30-day period, I was traveling to NSA, CIA, around the Air Force people, logistics people in particular, and the training people to find out what they were doing, where they were doing it. My wife and I got on an airplane and went to Saudi in August of '85. And we got there after a roundabout way, and it was 118 degrees on the ramp at Dalaran when we got off the airplane at 10 o'clock at night. And said, this is going to be hard.
Just like Arizona.
And so in the course of doing that, it was a great experience. I had people that worked in the Air Force, Army, the Navy, and the joint sections of the Saudi forces. And I was interfacing with my boss, the ambassador, and the commander of Central Command, which was my military boss, on a constant basis. As you interface with the Saudis, they invited you to go to different events, and one of the events was the Feast El Fitr, which is the celebrating ceremony and dinner after the end of Ramadan. And so the governor of the Eastern Province, who was a young guy, graduated from La Jolla College. He loved to wear Levi's, white t-shirt, white tennis shoes, and so if you went to visit him in his house, that's the way he'd meet you, instead of in his robes and thobes and gutras and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the formality was down.
But having said that, the issue was you went in there and this gentleman is hosting about 600 people at a dinner. And you walk into the first room, which was, if you just take a gymnasium and you put chairs around the outside edge of it all the way around that room, and there's nothing in the middle. And he's sitting in a throne-like chair down one side of that particular structure. And so you come through the door and you've been told to go take the seat on the right side of the governor. And so I'm walking across there, I've got my Class A's on, and all these thobes and gutras and swords and everything is all around, and here's this guy walking across in a blue uniform with his Arabian Affairs advisor, little guy from Palestine. Love the guy, Azum. But go over there and sit down. Then at that point, they start, as the hall fills up, they start communicating with each other, and to do that, you have to drink gawa, coffee, or chai, tea. So they're bringing that around and pouring it to you. So a guy comes around, and he's got a little plate. It's got about 10 cups on it. And he's got a long spout, and he pours that coffee into the gawa into one of those cups, and he hands it to you. And he goes on down the line, and he comes back, and he gathers up his cups and sets them on the tray, and he goes to the next 10. And he keeps on going down the line.
So everybody's drinking out of the same 10 cups.
And then either in front of them or behind them or both, there's a guy with incense. And so he's got an incense burner, and he's got sandalwood, which is very hard to get and very expensive. Mm-hmm. And they're burning that wood to create the incense. And so they bring it over, and the object to be a friend is to fan that smoke into your face and your upper body. Mm-hmm. And so then they go away, and then they come back again with another smoker, and they fan some more. So 2 or 3 times like that, and then somebody says something, and the governor gets up, and he starts heading for the hall that we're going to eat in. And so the governor goes in, I'm the next guy behind him, and he goes over to a wash basin, holds his hands out, and they pour water over him. They give him some soap, and pours water over, then they give him a towel, and now it's my turn, except the wash basin goes away and everybody goes and sits down.
We've already done this. Yeah. It sounds like it was quite a
fun. So he
deep
reaches
into the culture.
They serve a big baby camel in front of him, and baby goats, lambs. It's all on trays full of rice, lots of stuff. And so the governor reaches over and pulls off a little piece of loin off of the camel. It was delicious, absolutely great. And he reaches over, knowing that the Americans know that they prize eyes as a delicacy. And he reached over and he looked at me as he put his fingers into the eye socket. And he says, "I won't do that to you, Russ."
We can be friends. That's a real dip into the culture, I think.
Yeah.
You know. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention? Or?
No, I just like to emphasize one thing, that the families that are part of this structure make it possible for the crew members, for the enlisted person, for the officer to perform the mission, and the support they give by maintaining the family and taking care of the family and carrying it with you takes a load off of you. But there's never enough things you can do after the fact to pay them back for the services that they have. So I would just like to emphasize that while we were at the front end of the pointy sword, the folks who are keeping us there include family. That was very important.
Super. It's a good way to work, good place to end. And I want to thank you for your service.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for sharing your story.
Good.